All right, and hello everyone. I'd like to officially welcome you to tonight's Out of the Archives event with author Scott Bane. Before I introduce Scott and turn the mic over to him, I have a couple of announcements and just a little intro about the History Project. First of all, I'm Jonah Lacqua. I'm the Executive Director of the History Project, and we are Boston's LGBTQ+ community archives. We are an independent community archives, and we document, preserve, and share the LGBTQ+ history of Boston, Massachusetts, and our collection focuses broadly on New England. We just moved offices, so we are now on Boylston Street, and we are looking forward to hopefully having volunteers and researchers back in the archives after the new year, after we have some time to unpack. But in the meantime, please do, if you aren't familiar with our work, check us out at historyproject.org, and I'll put a couple of social media links in the chat as well. Our next Out of the Archives event is happening next Thursday. We will be hearing from Mary Lino and her collection of photography documenting protest attire. She'll be sharing photographs she's taken at protests of what people are wearing and how they've expressed themselves over time. Mary was with us a few years ago now with photos of her graffiti, and she is a known collector and donor of ephemera in Boston and Cambridge about all sorts of social justice movements. So if you're interested, please sign up for that talk. We'll be here at the same time. And my other quick plug is just, well, first of all, to thank you all so much for your support of the History Project. We really depend on individual donors to be able to do our programming. And I will put a link in the chat for anyone who's interested in making an additional donation tonight. And now, without further ado, it was my pleasure to introduce to you author Scott Bane. Scott grew up not 10 miles from where F.O. Matthiessen and Russell Cheney made their home in Kittery, Maine. After reading about the two men in the New York Times, Scott began researching their life together, leading him to libraries, archives, and historical societies throughout New England and the Northeast. Scott's a proud product of the City University of New York system, obtaining a BA from Hunter College, an MPA from Baruch College, and a JD from CUNY School of Law. He's a program officer at the John A. Hartford Foundation, and A Union Like Ours is Scott's first book. And Scott, here you are.
Yay. Thank you so much, Joan. I'm so pleased to be here this evening, and I'm going to share my screen to start the slides. Can everyone see that? Yep. Okay, great. Okay, well, again, so happy to be here. And I will start by saying that my thesis is very straightforward, that F.O. Matthiessen and Russell Cheney were in essence married in everything but name and legal rights. I've been working on this project, as Joan suggested at the beginning, since reading a book review in the New York Times in the spring of 2003 about the Crimson Letter, about gay men at Harvard. The review referenced Matthiessen and Cheney, as well as Mathiessen's most influential book, American Renaissance, Art and Expression in the Age of Emerson and Whitman. I went and checked out Mathiessen's book, First Chance I Got. And in the author's note at the very beginning, it's place-stamped Kittery, Maine. I'd grown up in this area, so that detail hooked me. I started to read everything I could about Matthiessen and Cheney and their relationship. And I saw the story of their shared life together as a love story. The book also has a brief autobiographical frame around it, around Matthiessen and Cheney's story. It did not start out that way. It started out as a straightforward double biography of Matthiessen and Cheney's story on its own. But at one point, I had the great privilege to work with the incomparable writing teacher, Bill Zinzer, and Bill said to me, "Why have you written this book? You're not a literary scholar or an art historian. What is it about this story that has captured your imagination? That is what has to come through." I resisted this at first because I think that's what writers do. They resist these suggestions. But I relented to the extent that I was willing to give it a try. And it did solve one important problem. of not wanting to end the book on Mathiessen's suicide. Because strange as it may sound, and as heartbreaking as Mathiessen's death by suicide on April 1st, 1950, at the age of 48 was, I don't read his and Cheney's story as a complete downer. There are sad parts of the story, to be sure, but watching and listening to these two men figure out their relationship in which they had no living role models was profoundly moving to me. Matthiessen was one of the preeminent scholars, literary scholars of his generation and the early to mid 20th century. Again, he wrote American Renaissance, and he helped found the field of American studies. Cheney was a moderately successful minor painter. During the 1920s, he was the hot, not quite so young thing in the art world. And Cheney's best paintings, in my opinion, are the landscapes, still lifes, interiors, and portraits of friends and neighbors in Maine and New Hampshire, where he and Matthiessen made their home. Oops. Oh, there we go. So, next slide there. F.O. Matthiessen and his family background. Matthiessen was born in 1902 in Pasadena, California. He was 20 years Cheney's junior. He grew up in LaSalle, Illinois, with his mother and paternal grandparents. He was very close to his mother, Lucy Orne Pratt, who had grown up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and was a distant relative of Maine writer Sarah Orne Jewett. She met Frederick William Matthiessen Jr. at a resort in California. F.W. Matthiessen Jr. was a playboy, and Matthiessen disliked him for much of his life, although toward the end of his life, they were reconciled. Matthiessen wrote in a letter to Cheney in the early days of their relationship that there was, quote, an empty space where my father should have been. Matthiessen was closer to his paternal grandfather, founder of the Western Clock Company, later known as West Clocks, and makers of the Big Ben alarm clocks. Lucy Orne Pratt and F.W. Matthiessen Jr. were married at the Church of the Unity, a Unitarian congregation, as the name implies, in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1893. Indicative of the industrial era wealth of the Matthiessen family, F.W. Matthiessen Sr. gave the newlyweds a check for $5,000, roughly the equivalent of $146,000 in 2021 dollars. But Matthiessen did not have a happy home life. His parents separated in 1908, and they divorced in 1916. Matthiessen and his older sister and their mother moved to Tarrytown, New York, about 40 minutes north of New York City. He was christened at Christ Church in Tarrytown, which happened to have been the same congregation or same church where Washington Irving had worshiped. He attended boarding school at the Hackley School, which is also in Tarrytown. And it was during Mathiessen's time at the Hackley School that he began to understand his attraction to other men. Hackley led to Yale, from which Matthiessen graduated in 1923. Matthiessen came to life intellectually at Yale, certainly his interest in literature, but also his interest in progressive politics and organized labor. He won a Rhodes Scholarship and spent 2 years at New College, Oxford. Russell Cheney typified everything that Matthiessen valued. He was a darkly handsome gay man. He was stereotypical Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite, but most important, he was a working artist. And it's been much more difficult to research and write about Cheney than it has Matthiessen. Matthiessen helped create a new discipline, American Studies. He was famous during his lifetime. So as a consequence, there have been many books and articles written about him and his legacy. Cheney, as I suggested earlier, was well known during the 1920s, but his painting has had less influence than Mathiessen's scholarship and writing. Cheney really came into focus when I put him in the context of his family. Born in 1881 in South Manchester, Connecticut, he was the youngest of 11 children of a very large extended family of silk manufacturers. Cheney Brothers Silk Manufacturing Company was a phenomenally successful business. Between the Civil War and World War II, they were one of the largest silk producers in the United States. They helped introduce machine-woven silk to the industry, and this slide shows the 36-acre campus of the mills that Cheney Brothers covered in South Manchester. This next slide is a contemporary photo of the mills today. Another important piece of Matthiessen and Cheney's story is their connection to Maine. It's because of the Cheney family's connection to Maine that Matthiessen and Cheney ended up in the Pine Tree State. Cheney's mother, Edna Dow Smith, had been born in South Berwick, Maine, and several Cheney family members spent summers in York Harbor. I found the photo on the left in a family photo album in the collection of the Connecticut Historical Society, indicating that it was the summer home of Knight Dexter Cheney, Russell Cheney's father. Then I found the photo on the right of the Cook Cottage in a 1936 book entitled York Harbor, Maine. Cheney's father died while staying in York Harbor in August of 1907. Cheney also graduated from Yale in 1904. He was very popular in college, but known for being quiet, and he was elected into the prestigious senior society Skull and Bones. It was there that he picked up the nickname Rat. 20 years later, Matthiessen was also elected into Skull and Bones, where he picked up the nickname Devil. And upon graduation, Cheney had already decided that he wanted to paint, although he spoke publicly about becoming an architect. Cheney studied at the New York Art Students League from 1904 to 1906. For Cheney, it was a bold decision to follow his chosen professional path of painting and not go into the family business. The desire to become an artist or architect was not unheard of in the extended Cheney family. Two of Cheney's great uncles, John Cheney and Seth Wells Cheney, had been painters and engravers, and Cheney's cousin, Charles Adams Platt, was a renowned residential and landscape architect. In South Manchester, Cheney created an artistic haven for himself when he converted a barn on the Cheney family compound into a painting studio. The main room was enormous, 40 feet long by 20 feet wide, with 15-foot ceilings and a large north-facing window. The studio was lined with leather-bound books, oriental rugs, and pieces of porcelain and china that Cheney had collected from his travels. And as you can see, there were paintings everywhere, on the walls and also in racks around the room. Cheney and Matthiessen met in 1924 aboard the ocean liner Paris. Matthiessen was bound for Oxford for the second year of his Rhodes Scholarship. He was 22. Cheney was bound for Venice. He was age 42. And here's a photo of the first-class dining room aboard the Paris. And I'm going to read a short selection from the early chapter in the book entitled Falling in Love. On the fourth day of the voyage, Matthiessen decided to speak more candidly about sex. Presumably, Matthiessen felt a spark of attraction to Cheney, and their shared Skull and Bones membership made it easier to reveal such confidences. Matthiessen brought up Havelock Ellis, whose writing on homosexuality he had read the previous spring, but then he backed away. Later, after an evening of stargazing on deck, Matthiessen brought Cheney into his cabin to give him a good night's snack of a pear. Then he summoned all his courage and jumped in. I know it won't make any difference to our friendship, but there's one thing I've got to tell you, he said by way of awkward preface. Referring to his days at the Hackley School, Matthiessen declared, I was sexually inverted. Of course, I've controlled it since. Matthiessen described the miraculous moment that followed. The munching of the pear died away. There was perhaps half a minute of the most heavily freighted silence I've ever felt. Then, in a faraway voice I had never heard, came the answer, my God, feller, you've turned me upside down. I'm that way too. Matthiessen and Cheney sat for several minutes in stunned silence. They were no longer alone. Each man had found another, someone who he viewed as an equal and a peer. Until then, both Matthiessen and Cheney had largely cordoned off their lives with friendships on one side and chance clandestine sexual encounters on the other side. But that night, aboard the Paris, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a different world in which love and sex could come together suddenly blossomed. This moment of emotional communion, however, did not lead to sex. Instead, Matthiessen and Cheney stayed up until 4 o'clock in the morning, talking about their respective sexual histories and experiences, just as each man had done as part of his induction into Skull and Bones. When Cheney said goodnight before returning to his own cabin, he affectionately tousled Mathiessen's hair and thanked him for his courage in speaking so candidly. The remainder of the voyage passed quickly as Cheney and Matthiessen talked and talked. On the last night, they rested on a couch in Cheney's cabin with Cheney's head in Mathiessen's lap. Later, they changed positions with both men simply lying next to the other, fully dressed. Their shoulders and knees occasionally touched. Words ebbed as each man savored the presence of the other. And then Cheney turned and kissed Matthiessen squarely on the lips, and Matthiessen ran his fingers through Cheney's wondrously thick hair. In a more contemporary era, this might have been prelude to sex, but not for Matthiessen and Cheney. As Matthiessen later wrote about the experience, that was all. The next morning, we shook hands and I got off the boat at Plymouth. I knew I had a new, unbelievably rich friendship. He and Cheney made plans to meet in Italy over Mathiessen's Christmas holiday and pledged to write often. And write they did. Part of what makes Matthiessen and Cheney's story so appealing to research and write about is how incredibly well documented it is. During their lifetimes, Matthiessen and Cheney exchanged roughly 3,100 letters with one another. They told each other everything. The letters are very open and candid. And Matthiessen and Cheney's relationship influenced Mathiessen's scholarship, especially in the early days. Feelings, experiences, literature, and language all fused together as Matthiessen and Cheney fell in love. For example, Matthiessen read Walt Whitman's poetry in the early days of their relationship and wrote to Cheney that he was thrilled to discover that literature was not just about reading, it was about living. And the relationship also influenced Cheney's painting. Prior to meeting Matthiessen, Cheney's paintings in Europe were of the well-known main stops on the tourist circuit, notably in Paris and Venice. But after Matthiessen and Cheney met, Cheney moves in the direction of a bolder, more stylized view of the world. He wrote to Matthiessen, quote, Godfeller, I feel this last year, he's writing in 1925, has enriched and deepened me. To have really deeply felt Giotto and stood with you there before the windows at Chartres, to have at once reached the full expression of my physical life, to have seen the new vision of beauty, to know that to love and to create are the same. F.O. Matthiessen, this painting, F.O. Matthiessen, was done in Florence in 1926, and Cheney painted many portraits of Matthiessen over the years. This is one of my favorites. I like Mathiessen's affect of young man ready to take on the world. He's 24 years old in this painting. Mathiessen's first book was also the first biography of Sarah Orne Jewett, published in 1929. And later, Jewett biographers claimed that Matthiessen and Willa Cather helped resuscitate interest in Jewett's work. Matthiessen published this book when he was 27 years old, and their personal associations abound in connection with it. Sarah Orne Jewett marked Matthiessen and Cheney's only official public collaboration. Cheney contributed images of 3 paintings to the book: Miss Jewett's Staircase, 1927, Jewett House, thought to be 1927, and also Jewett Doorway, also thought to be 1927. F.O. Matthiessen as an adult. For starters, he was a small man. He was short. He was about 5 foot 6 inches tall. He favored rimless glasses. He was ambitious, driven, competitive. With friends, he could be warm and supportive, but he could also be sharp and explosive. And his speech was often marked by pauses, as though he carefully considered his words and thought out his ideas in real time. Kittery, Maine. The importance of Kittery in Matthiessen and Cheney's story cannot be overstated. Matthiessen and Cheney were very happy together in Kittery. And as I've suggested, the 2 men ended up in Kittery because of Cheney's connection with the area. Kittery was their one true home in the world. And part of what fascinates me about Matthiessen and Cheney's story is that they were accorded a fairly high degree of privacy at Kittery to live together as a same-sex couple from 1930 to 1945. Mathiessen's graduate students would join them for Thanksgiving dinners or in the summers in Kittery. And Matthiessen had gotten to know T.S. Eliot when Eliot began as a Charles Eliot Norton Professor of Poetry at Harvard in the fall of 1932. And then over the summer of 1933, Eliot was Matthiessen and Cheney's house guest at Kittery. In interviewing Mathiessen's students, a number of whom were still alive when I began this project in the early aughts, several of them told me that they all knew Matthiessen was gay, but they did not talk about it. Here's another photo of the back of the house. But at Kittery, Matthiessen in particular could relax. He could get away from the stress of Harvard. He was working to create the history and literature program, and while he enjoyed his students and the tutorial system, it was very difficult for him because of being gay. For example, in January of 1930, he wrote to Cheney, "Another session with the professor of public speaking. He made some useful suggestions. He told me that my way of speaking tends to be blurred and soft. Does it? Am I just like any fairy?" And then a week later, he wrote, "My sex bothers me, feller. Sometimes when it makes me aware of the falseness of my position in the world, and consciousness of that falseness seems to sap my confidence of power. Have I any right in a community that would so utterly disapprove of me if it knew the facts? I ask myself, and then I laugh, for I know that I would never ask it at all if isolation from you didn't make me search into myself. I need you, feller, for together we can confront whatever there is." Over the years, Cheney did many paintings of his and Mathiessen's house in Kittery, including this one facing east, Kittery, Maine, 1944. Cheney was the working artist deeply connected to and reflective of the community of which he and Matthiessen were a part. And this was a very important idea to Matthiessen, which he touched on in his book, Translation and Elizabethan Art and in American Renaissance. Cheney put into practice many of the ideas that Matthiessen considered in a scholarly and analytical way. Cheney described how he sat near the ocean one night in Kittery, quote, sat there a long while with the tide swishing and swirling and gurgling, and the moon so bright and light on the house, and pear blossoms, a wonderfully rich, poignant moment somehow, the sense of really belonging, of being fused with the surroundings, and part of it, a sort of wide open peace. Cheney captured the physical beauty of Maine and New Hampshire. He was an en plein air painter and a frequent sight on the streets of Kittery and nearby Portsmouth with his easel. Cheney put down roots in Kittery. He got to know local people, and many of them appeared in his paintings. One such painting is Cheney's portrait of Howard Lathrop, 1937, a local Portsmouth fisherman and friend of Matthiessen and Cheney's. This is one of Cheney's strong portraits from the late 1930s, and I especially like Lathrop's sensitive eyes. This is one of the most reproduced images in all of Cheney's work, and it's owned by the Portsmouth Public Library in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. In May 1941, Mathiessen's most enduring book, American Renaissance, Art and Expression in the Age of Emerson and Whitman, was published. American Renaissance is not strictly literary criticism, which is one of its appeals. Matthiessen taps multiple disciplines: literature, history, painting, sculpture, and architecture. The question at the center of the book is fairly straightforward. In the years 1850 to 1855, a number of classic texts by American authors were published, including The Scarlet Letter, 1850, The House of Seven Gables, 1851, Moby Dick, 1851, Walden, 1854, and Leaves of Grass, 1855. Matthiessen asks, why? What did this moment of cultural expression represent? How did it come about? And why did it happen when it did? In subsequent decades, the book has been criticized as being too narrowly conceived, but the book did help establish the field of American studies. And that in turn helped establish Matthiessen as one of the preeminent scholars of his generation and paved the way to his appointment as a full professor at Harvard in 1942. On reading the manuscript, Cheney said that he was strongly struck by the fine intricacy of pattern and thought in the book. On the surface, Matthiessen and Cheney would in many ways seem to live a charmed life. A beautiful house in Maine, Cheney's paintings, and Mathiessen's books and writings. But both men had their fair share of health problems. For Cheney, it started in 1916 to 1918 when he was treated for tuberculosis at Cragmore Sanatorium in Colorado Springs. Cheney lost 3 of his 11 siblings to tuberculosis, 1 sister and 2 brothers, and he was plagued by breathing problems throughout his life. But beginning in the late 1930s, Cheney was in and out of sanatoriums for his breathing difficulties, as well as his increased problems with drinking. Lewis Hyde, who edited the collection of Matthiessen and Cheney's correspondence, Rat and the Devil, speculated in his notes to that book that in the last years of Cheney's life, he crossed the line into alcoholism. The Hartford Retreat was founded in 1822 by Dr. Eli Todd, who created moral treatment, which maintained that mental illnesses are curable diseases rather than moral failings. Cheney was treated at the retreat in 1938, and treatment at the time consisted largely of rest, occupational, physical, and talk therapies. It's not known exactly what Cheney was admitted to the retreat for, but judging from his correspondence with Matthiessen, it seems that Cheney and his doctors believed that his ongoing breathing difficulties scared him and that he drank excessively to try and calm himself. Many of the institutions in which Matthiessen and Cheney found themselves catered to well-to-do men and women. These institutions tried to erase as many traces of institutional living as possible and create home-like atmospheres. During Cheney's time at the Hartford retreat, it boasted a barber shop for men, a dressmaker and beauty shop for women, a regular afternoon tea, a library, a smoking room, a gym, a pool, tennis courts, and a bowling alley. Matthiessen entered McLean Hospital on the day after Christmas 1938, nominally over the stress of completing American Renaissance. And it was at McLean that Matthiessen recorded his first suicidal impulses. He wrote, "I was hauled out of sleep by the fantasy that it would be better if I jumped out a window. And during the succeeding week in Kittery, I was recurrently filled with the desire to kill myself." Associated with Harvard Medical School, McLean has had many famous patients over the years, including poets Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, and Robert Lowell, and singer James Taylor. Originally situated on 250 acres in Belmont, Massachusetts, about a half an hour west of Boston, McLean had all the comforts of the retreat and then some. Beef and dairy farms, vegetable and flower gardens, apple and pear orchards, and even an apiary, all for occupational therapy par excellence. Matthiessen wrote several long diary entries that described his treatment at McLean. He underwent hydrotherapy, soaking in a tub to relax. He took a pottery class as a form of occupational therapy. He exercised and listened to music, and he participated in talk therapy. Fears of Cheney's death dominated Mathiessen's thoughts at McLean. As usual, Matthiessen and Cheney were more intimate in their letters. Matthiessen wrote to Cheney, "Well, the letters warmed me right through, just as they used to do when I was at Oxford and you were in Santa Fe, or whenever we were long apart. It's one of the real beauties that never once has the freshness of your life lost any trace of its magic for me. Every day is a new discovery of your wealth." Beginning in the fall of 1940, Cheney was in and out of Baldpate Hospital for roughly 3 years. Located in Georgetown, Massachusetts, about 40 minutes north of Boston, Baldpate opened in 1939, led by Dr. Harry Solomon, who was an early proponent of halfway houses, which specialize in helping patients acclimate themselves to life outside institutional walls. Baldpate specialized in treatment for alcohol and drug addictions, personality disorders, neuroses, and psychoses. Cheney was probably admitted to Baldpate for his drinking, and Baldpate's setting and amenities resembled those of the Hartford Retreat and McLean, but there was one important distinction at Baldpate. Doctors at Baldpate relied on neurological means to cure mental illnesses, in addition to psychiatric treatments such as talk therapy and occupational therapy, among others. As a consequence, doctors at Baldpate relied on shock therapies, including insulin shock therapy, in which a coma was induced in a patient with large doses of insulin, and metrazole, and electroshock therapies in which seizures were induced in patients. Doctors at Baldpate also performed lobotomies. I've uncovered circumstantial but compelling evidence that in May 1942, Cheney underwent metrazole shock therapy to try and help with his drinking problem. As Cheney wrote to Matthiessen on May 4th, 1942, I want to take the drastic step that he, Dr. Fleming, Cheney's doctor, suggests. I don't care how hard it is, I'm going to do it. A course of metrazole shock therapy consisted of approximately 7 injections of the drug over 4 weeks. Metrazole induced seizures in patients, the idea being somewhat akin to rebooting your computer. The doctors were trying to reboot the nervous systems of patients. Seizures typically started 15 seconds after an injection and lasted for up to a minute. Patients were gagged and bound during the procedure so as not to injure themselves. Perhaps not surprisingly, metrazole shock therapy was not successful in helping Cheney with his drinking. But in 1943, Cheney did hit on a better method to control his drinking, especially in the winter months. He went to live with his sister Theodora and her husband in Texas, where the climate did not aggravate his breathing problems. But he missed New England and life with Matthiessen. Cheney had returned to Maine in the early summer of 1945. And he died of thrombosis on July 12th. And thrombosis is a blood clot in the circulatory system. Cheney's body was returned to South Manchester, and he was buried from the same house in which he had been born. After Cheney's death, Matthiessen worked diligently to secure the painter's legacy. Notably, in 1946-1947, he published a monograph of Cheney's work entitled Russell Cheney, A Record of His Work, which remains the most comprehensive single volume devoted to the painter's legacy. And in the days, weeks, months, and years that followed Cheney's death, Matthiessen, as if seeking camaraderie in a different sphere, threw himself into political activism. Since his earliest days as a student at Yale, Matthiessen had been interested in progressive political causes, often in association with organized labor. In the mid-1930s, for example, he helped organize the Harvard Teachers Union. But after Cheney's death, Mathiessen's political activism was nonstop. Following on this slide and the next one is a list of events that Matthiessen participated in or organizations with which he was affiliated. And this is all in addition to his teaching duties at Harvard, writing books on Henry James, the James family, and Russell Cheney, as well as editing collections of Henry James's stories and notebooks. Mathiessen's grief over Cheney's death presumably contributed to his nonstop work and political activism. But there's a social aspect of grief that cannot be ignored for a same-sex couple here. Matthiessen couldn't let on to the world how deeply he was grieving Cheney's death. To the world, he had simply lost his good friend and housemate. This forced dissimulation over the depth of his grief, having to hide the depth of his grief on some level, must have played a part in Mathiessen's deepening depression in the years after Cheney's death. And the second reading is from a later chapter in the book entitled Losing Touch, Life Without Cheney. But if happiness beckoned across the Atlantic, subterranean thoughts and emotions simultaneously compelled Matthiessen toward a darker course. Matthiessen had returned to Boston from Maine, and on Friday, March 31st, he left his Pinckney Street apartment and checked in at the Manager Hotel on Causeway Street, adjacent to North Station. Matthiessen needed height for what he planned to do. He was shown to room 1219 facing southwest. Matthiessen had dinner plans at the home of Kenneth and Eleanor Murdoch back on Beacon Hill, so he did not settle into his room for the hotel room for the night. To Murdoch, Matthiessen seemed tired and depressed at dinner. Matthiessen presumably didn't say anything to his friends about having checked into the Manger Hotel earlier that day. On parting after dinner at about 30 minutes before midnight, Matthiessen told the Murdochs to remember that he loved them. It was a cloudy night, but comparatively mild for early spring with temperatures in the high 40s. On getting back to his hotel room, Matthiessen continued to prepare his room. On his desk, he placed his Skull and Bones pin and a letter in which he asked that his friends, Kenneth Murdoch, Helen Bane Knapp, and Ruth Putnam, as well as his sister, Lucy Newbrand, be contacted, but not until morning. In the letter, Matthiessen also asked that they go to his apartment and see that several other letters on his desk were mailed. In one of those letters, Matthiessen told Paul Sweezy that he feared there was nothing but desolate solitude ahead. He told Lewis Hyde that he could no longer bear the loneliness with which I'm faced. To his friends generally, Matthiessen wrote, "I am exhausted. I've been subject to so many severe depressions during the past few years that I can no longer believe that I can continue to be of use to my profession and my friends. I hope my friends will be able to believe that I still love them in spite of this desperate act." Perhaps another half hour passed. Matthiessen took off his glasses. Perhaps time enough to think about the cottage in Kittery, the most beautiful house in America, or to recall the cats, Baby and Pretzel. Time enough to remember riding his bicycle through the English countryside during his Oxford days, shouting out with joy, "Rat, rat, my Godfeller, how I love you." Or the day he stood on the beach in Maine, clad only in seaweed, his arms outstretched toward the ocean and the sky. Or the incident of the pair, the night aboard the Paris after he and Cheney had met. At about midnight outside the Manger on Nashua Street, a taxi driver named Jesse Reeves was startled by a tremendous noise. A man had just fallen or jumped from a 12th floor window. Matthiessen was still breathing when the ambulance crew arrived, but he died before they could reach City Hospital 2.5 miles away. As I said at the beginning, the book ends with a short autobiographical chapter of how my then partner, now husband, David, and I had our own journey through the land of illness with back-to-back cancer diagnoses, and how we got married about a year after marriage equality passed in New York State. We read one of Mathiessen's early letters to Cheney during the ceremony, as if bringing them into our wedding. And the letter reads as follows. "Marriage, what a strange word to be applied to two men. Can't you hear the hellhounds of society baying in full pursuit behind us? But that's just the point. We are beyond society. We've said thank you very much, stepped outside, and closed the door." And then this is how the book ends. There was only one thing about the wedding that David and I would have done differently. We did not take a post-wedding trip. Being 17 years into our relationship at the time, I couldn't quite bring myself to use the word honeymoon. We got married on a Saturday, and on Monday, both of us went back to our day-to-day lives. This was a mistake. Getting married was exhilarating. And in retrospect, it would have been nice to have had a little decompression time. But we didn't know that. We were figuring out things as we went along. Not helping matters, it poured down rain that Monday morning after the wedding, cascading streams of water, and I was beginning to come down with a head cold. I drifted into a maudlin state. That morning, David sent an old photograph of himself as a young man to a friend and copied me on the email. Many years ago, her husband had died prematurely of cancer. The dark, rainy morning, not feeling well, seeing David as a young man, and thoughts of early deaths from cancer all set me off. I started to cry. I'd been so exhilarated over the weekend, but I was suddenly conscious of life's fragility and its brevity. One of us will likely die first. Although my ill health could hold surprises, based on our ages, David is likely to go first. The warmth, companionship, intimacy, and love, such that I had never known in my adult life, will come to an end. Will I die? Will the end kill me? I stood in the bedroom crying. By this time, David had showered and dressed. He too stood in the bedroom, ready to go to work. He wasn't going to descend into this morass of unfounded fears and anxieties with me. He gave me a hug and a kiss, and then put both hands on my shoulders. Yes, it will end, he said. But we will have experienced something beautiful and timeless. Oh, I'm so sorry, everyone. And the world will go on. He looked at me with his steady, calm blue eyes. David left the apartment, crying. I waved from the window, so intensely aware of the impermanent and transitory nature of the moment. In their day, Matthiessen and Cheney kept love alive in the face of some daunting obstacles, and they in turn helped me to keep love alive. I suppose it is this cycle, this transfer of spirit and values, that gives me any real sense of immortality as a palpable force in the world. Others will follow David and me, just as we followed Matthiessen and Cheney, and unions like ours will continue to be written. The end. That's it. Thank you, everyone.
Clapping on Zoom is strange because it stops you. It gets rid of the sound of clapping. So it's a bunch of people just making the motions and no sound. But thank you so much for sharing all of your research and your own story. I want to make sure that people saw, I put a link in the chat to where you can pick up the book from UMass Press. And there was a discount code, I thought, but if we want to share that with the group.
Yes, I'll try and.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
I'll look at the recording and find it and email it to
Okay,
everyone.
I'll get that for you.
But yeah, we're going to transition into our Q&A. I usually ask the first couple of questions to warm people up, but I'm a little verklempt, is that the word? Because that was just so lovely. And I will say, as someone who does this kind of, searching for LGBTQ people who are really kind of our cultural ancestors, that when you spend a lot of time with someone and a lot of time in someone's relationship, it is really hard not to become emotional about that. And that just resonated so much in the stories that you've told about Matthiessen and Cheney tonight. It was just so very lovely.
Thank you.
And so folks are saying thank you in the chat, but we're open for Q&As. We can do, there's the hand raise function if folks want to use that, or if anyone's on camera and wants me to let you unmute, I can do that as well. Or please feel free to use the chat. I guess the question I have is, now that the book is out, what are you doing now? I can't imagine. How do you move on to, or do you move on from a project and a story like this?
Well, I've been very fortunate to have a number of speaking events in connection with the book. And since I'm responsible for organizing those by and large, not exclusively, there's been a lot of pounding the pavement to make that happen, and pulling materials together for presentations and talks and interviews. So there's been a lot to do in connection with that. I've also had a couple of related articles published. I had a piece published in Down East magazine this month, sort of talking about the intersection of my personal connection with Maine, as well as Matthiessen and Cheney's story, and I mean, I probably can't get away with it with this crowd, but my running joke is prior to learning about Matthiessen and Cheney, I thought I was the only gay guy from Maine. But it has been fascinating to find history hiding in my own backyard.
And I think it's especially, I don't know if it's when you don't grow up in a city in New England, I'll put it that way, there's LGBTQ history all around us, but you have to dig for it a little bit deeper. I learned recently, while I'm waiting for folks to write their questions in the chat, and I should have known this, the first lesbian couple ever, I don't know if they were actually put on trial, but the first lesbian couple ever caught in Massachusetts was in Plymouth, which is where I grew up, which makes sense considering, the colony. But I was kind of excited. And then I was like, who do you tell that to? What else is there have been lesbians here since, 16, whatever. But yeah, so questions, comments? Everyone's just soaking it in. I will say, have you found in your presentations to groups, you had mentioned that you presented with Harvard. Have you, what has the reaction to your work been? And have you learned anything new along the way as you've been on this speaking tour?
The reaction has been very positive. And what's been really gratifying is the people who have stepped forth that have had either some connection, largely to Matthiessen, not as much to Cheney, but some connection to Matthiessen, people who had focused their graduate studies on Mathiessen's work, have contacted me through my website. But probably the absolute best was there, and I don't think he's on tonight, there was a man whose father, a gay man, whose father worked in the FBI during Mathiessen's lifetime. And he just, I was just shocked that, and his father was assigned to cover the universities. So he was pretty sure that his father had tried to, had tailed Matthiessen at some point, but just that connection was fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's very small world. There are some questions in the chat, and I'll read them out loud so that folks who can't see the chat can follow along. Martha asks, did Cheney and Matthiessen know Newton Arvin, who was a professor of English at Smith? He was charged in 1960 with pornography, which I think may be a little bit after the time period you're talking about, but have you run across Newton Arvin in your research?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And Matthiessen very much knew Arvin, and he had reviewed some of Arvin's books, and they were very much in touch. Dan Aaron was still alive when I started this project, and he told me, I did not find this in writing anyplace, but he told me that Matthiessen used to poke fun at Arvin for his girlish affect behind his back. I don't know if that's true. And also I was told, I'm forgetting where I learned this though. I was told that Arvin was considered to step into Mathiessen's job at Harvard after Mathiessen's death.
I would wonder too, there's some more questions in the chat. With Matthiessen having lived on Pinckney Street in Beacon Hill, what other sort of LGBTQ, literary and art figures he may have crossed paths with, considering that so many lived in the area. In a similar sort of, this is an awful segue, my apologies. Mary asks, how much time did the two actually live together, given how much time they spent in health facilities? And I imagine with such a large amount of correspondence that they weren't together all the time.
Right. The arrangement was that Matthiessen was in Cambridge during the week when he was teaching, but he would go to Maine on weekends and certainly over summer holidays. They purchased the house in Kittery in 1930, and they were really there until the early 40s. That's when the long hospitalizations started in. So they did spend a lot of time apart, but they were together quite a bit too, and certainly at Kittery. And as I found a great article from a tiny local paper called the Kittery Press, from the early 1930s, about one of Cheney's shows that described Matthiessen and Cheney as partners, which again, it didn't have the same connotations that it has now, but even that was fascinating to me.
And that actually, Kevin's asking, can Cheney's paper paintings be seen anywhere in New England? Are they in any museums that you know of?
Yes, but whether or not they are on view, that's the Wadsworth Athenaeum owns them, Yale, Harvard owns them, Cheney paintings. The Smithsonian owns some of Cheney's paintings, but you heard it here first. Over the summer, I believe, of 2024, there will be a show of Cheney's work at the Ogunquit Museum of American Art, organized by Kevin Murphy, who is an art historian at Vanderbilt. And it will be in Ogunquit and Vanderbilt. So I'm hoping that I will finally be able to own the color coffee table book of Cheney's work.
Excellent. So we'll put it on our calendar for summer 2024.
Yes.
To head up to Ogunquit. And actually, Tony asks in a similar Maine vein if the Kittery house is preserved at all, if there's any kind of marker or anything there.
Oh, sad news. The house was just sold for a little over $2 million. And I contacted the broker, and because of course there was a story in the local paper, and she said, of course she did not reveal who the buyers were, but she said, oh, they're devoted to preserving the artistic traditions of Matthiessen and Cheney. Now, what that actually means, I have no idea. But hopefully the contents will be preserved in some way, because they were largely left intact. Matthiessen left the house to Lewis Hyde, who left it to his children, and they all used it as a summer place. So I actually together with a retired American Studies professor from BU, Richard Candy, and one of Cheney's great nieces, Carol Cheney, and a literary scholar from Northwestern, Jay Grossman, who has written a lot about Matthiessen. We all got together to try and catalog the books, many of which were still there in the house in 2008 or 2009, somewhere then.
Wow.
Yeah, we eventually gave up. We didn't finish it, but we tried.
Book cataloging, speaking as an archivist who's cataloged my fair share of book collections in houses, it's a lot of work.
Mhm.
But it still must have been a really amazing experience to be in that space and
It was.
yeah.
It was a privilege.
Wonderful. So we usually end at 8. There are 2 more questions in the chat. So Scott, if you'll stick around with us for a couple minutes, I'll ask them.
I'm game if you guys are.
Cool. And if anyone needs to leave, no hard feelings. We're not keeping track of you here. But John asks about the the chat moved, the House of Un-American Activities Committee. He says he once heard that Matthiessen was harassed by the committee. Is that correct, or is that sort of apocryphal?
Oh my God, I think this is one of the historical sleuthing moments that I'm most proud of in connection with the book. It has been repeated over and over and over again that Matthiessen testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and it seems to come from Paul Sweezy's essay in the memorial volume that was published about Matthiessen entitled The Collective Portrait. But no, he did not testify before HUAC. He probably appeared before a baby HUAC, a state commission of some kind. And I went I went searching for legislative histories in Massachusetts at the Massachusetts State Archives. I was not able to find anything. But yes, he certainly was at odds with reporters about his political activism, but he did not testify before HUAC.
Which I think is, when you start looking at that time period, I think we all start to think, you know, everyone was caught up in the lavender scare in some way or another. The final question is from Terry, and Terry asks, how did Matthiessen handle Cheney's alcoholism? You talked about Cheney going away to, was it Georgetown or?
One of the hospitals was in Georgetown, Massachusetts. And the short answer is it was incredibly stressful. And that's part of what was interesting to me. I mean, Cheney was getting sick at right about the pinnacle of Mathiessen's fame soon after American Renaissance. And it was interesting to me to just think about the human side to this story, to have a partner who was in and out of a sanatorium for 3 years that underwent shock treatment. And Matthiessen was very lonely because they, as I say in the book, it was sort of during this period that they were most apart. And so it was very stressful. And I tried as best I could to give that aspect of their story its due and to treat it seriously. So yes, I would say that's my short answer.
Well, thank you so much. And I would say, actually, I'm going to just say what Mary says in the chat, but thank you so much. I too find their relationship very moving. It has been an absolute pleasure to spend this time with you tonight. And thank you so much for reading from the book and sharing about your research. And I will be sending an email out to everyone afterwards with some more links to where you can pick up the book and information about our upcoming history project events. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful long weekend. And again, Scott, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Good night, everyone.